So another thing that I can do in TinkerCAD to make things a little bit easier to work with is I can edit the grid that I see, and I can also adjust how my objects snap into or connect to that grid. So in the bottom right-hand corner, I have a Edit Grid button. This will allow me to change it from millimeters to inches. Inches are what we use here in the United States. A little bit harder to read at times, but I could change my grid properties. I could also change how my grid looks. I'm going to keep it in millimeters just because it's a little bit easier. So if I were to change my width of my grid to 100 and the height to 100, when I hit Update Grid, you're going to see the size of this grid change. So I went from a large grid to a small grid. So depending on the objects, the size of the objects that I'm going to be creating, I can adjust my work plane accordingly. I'm going to go ahead and change that back so I have my larger grid. Another thing that I can do is I can choose how my objects connect to that grid or that workspace here. So I see that as I move my object, it's actually locking into points. That right now is what's called snapping to my grid. So it's snapping every millimeter. If I were to change this to every 5, as I drag this, you'll notice that it's now snapping every 5 and that it's not snapping a little bit at a time. I could also turn this off. And so now when I'm moving this, it's actually kind of moving freely versus snapping into my grid. So that is how I can edit my grid, and I can adjust how my objects connect to that grid.